Welcome to Voices in Action, a new podcast by the Eastern Oregon Center for Independent Living about disability in Oregon. I'm your host, Leo Alenak. Over the course of this first season, we'll cover a variety of topics related to disability justice education, speak with leaders of local advocacy organizations, and learn from one another in the process. This week, we'll be discussing the documentary The Way We Talk with director Mike Turner, who currently resides in Silverton, Oregon. This episode will be a little different than usual. As Mike and I will discuss, the nature of podcast work means a lot of hours spent editing the audio. I'm usually meticulous about removing pauses, and misspoken words when possible. But since this is a conversation about stuttering, I realized that the way I go about this editing process can be ableist. As such, I have left this interview entirely unedited, with the exception of adding this introduction, the usual outro, and removing a few bits of entirely dead air. We don't come to a clear, specific solution about how to edit moving forward, but the entire reason for Voices in Action is to have conversations like these. To start with, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Mike Turner. I'm a filmmaker of sorts, and I stutter. And those two things came together to make a movie called The Way We Talk, which is why I'm here today, I think.
So what got you into filmmaking?
Well, before we started recording, I thought it was cool what you were saying just now, which is that a lot of people think that disability is one thing not connected to many other things. For me, I felt like my stuttering has been completely intertwined with every aspect of who I am in ways that I'm still realizing. And I think when I was younger, like in high school, I had a hard time expressing myself or saying how I felt verbally to people. Like I really felt like I was much more comfortable just being the kind of like silent person. And so I found film was a way for me to kind of show people who I was, I guess, without having to talk with them. Yeah, and I feel like there are still like echoes of that in the movies that I do make. They're all like pretty personal. They're nonfiction. They tend to be about like my own experiences or people that I've met. So yeah, like I really do feel like stuttering played a big role in me taking this path.
So something that's interesting too that I think we kind of mentioned in our emails setting this conversation up was talking about the potential the potential ableism of the editing process that goes on behind the scenes of this podcast. So I spend hours meticulously editing conversations with people to create the quote unquote cleanest sound possible, editing out pauses, breaths, misspeaking. But even saying something like clean sound implies that there's such a thing as dirty sound, right? Which is this very weird concept. So I was thinking about this when I was watching your documentary where you often utilize voiceovers. And so I was wondering what your thoughts are on how, this podcast and many other podcasts approach sound editing and how we could improve upon it to be inclusive of different speech patterns.
Wow, that's an interesting question. What comes to mind, a lot of things come to mind. One thing is that I have a friend who stutters, who I hear on NPR from time to time, just being interviewed about different things. Like he's a journalist on the East Coast, and he stutters quite a bit, but on the radio, he's able to manage it really well. And you'll kind of hear like a little stutter every now and then. And I'm never sure if they're editing it out afterwards or if like he like all of us who stutter have techniques we utilize to smooth out the sound when we need to, some like more successful than others, successful being like kind of an ableist word as well. But, like you get a social penalty in our culture for stuttering in the public eye. It's difficult to like own that, I think, and just like let it come, I think I'm getting better at it as I get older, and like using it as an opportunity to like try and talk to people about what stuttering is. But it definitely wasn't always that way. And yeah, I mean, leaving the stuttering in the voiceover in that movie, the way we talk, it's like, that was like a big reason why I wanted to make it, actually, was just to like hear stuttering in a movie like that. Because I use voiceover a lot. And prior to that movie, I had always edited out my stuttering. I had just come off of making this hour-long movie for OPB that I narrated, and I recorded the voiceover in the middle of the night in this sound studio where no one would hear it. It took many hours to do, like reading the same sentence over and over again, just in parts or just by word, so I could then edit it together without stuttering. And after that experience, I just like, the next movie that I make has to have stuttering in it. And I think there were a bunch of different things in my life that led me to making that particular movie, but that was like a big part of it too. And so, yeah, just to answer your question, hopefully it's like I do love hearing stuttering. Like I love working on that movie and getting to like cold call people that I wanted to interview, and you would hear them answer the phone and stutter on their name. It was just this like signal that we had with each other, that they, they would quickly learn that I stuttered, and it was just cool. And so it was wonderful. And I still love meeting people who stutter in the wild. There's like a lot more of us than people think usually. And so, yeah, I mean, just in terms of voice, it's like I would love to hear that more often. Like I'm working on a new movie now that's not about stuttering, that I am planning on keeping my stuttering in the voiceover. So it'll be kind of an interesting experiment. Like on one hand, I do hope that people kind of understand it better now, like Joe Biden, like famously stutters or overcame, quote unquote, stuttering. Yeah, I just hope people recognize it and like appreciate it as like another way of talking.
Yeah, and something that literally I only remembered when you mentioned Joe Biden was the very famous movie about the King's Speech, about overcoming stuttering and how that was, I mean, it's not necessarily a unique narrative in terms of the overcoming disability. It's a very ableist narrative, but it's not uncommon. But I just remember that was, and I think a major part of it too was because of the era, it was only communications over radio. So it was important for these like high-ranking figures to show that they didn't stutter. And so I think that's also interesting too, in terms of like I don't know if it would be, it's not necessarily classism, but like that kind of thing of like, it's okay for, the average person to stutter, but not these like high ranking people that are supposed to represent everyone or
Right.
what have you. So it's very strange. I mean, there's also the famous thing of like, and this is more getting into politics, but like that one political debate, presidential debate way back, that was like, if you saw, I want to say it was like Nixon versus somebody, but if you saw it, then you thought one person won. But if you heard it, you thought the other person won because of how it was. Yeah. And so it's just interesting in terms of how we judge people based off of speech patterns. So,
yeah, it's definitely like a fascinating field. Like, with the King's Speech too, I think like as like ableist, I guess, as that movie is, and just how like cheesy it is, like I think it's still really like it's kind of like I guess a lot of movies that are coming out now where like representation really does matter, even if it's like a pretty mediocre movie, just to like see the main character of a Hollywood movie who stutters. And he's not like a villain or like intellectually disabled. I think not that there's, I mean, I'd like to see more representation of that as well, but it's like, I feel like stuttering is usually linked to those things. Like I was just, I'm like reading Harry Potter for the first time right now. And I think it was book 2 where, there's this teacher who stutters, and he's very like mild-mannered, always being like abused by Snape. And then like at the end, he's like tears off his cloak and he doesn't stutter anymore. He's like, like I tricked you all. You thought I was this like nobody, it's like weak. And so it's like, oh, stuttering. Wow, it's like a good trick, So yeah, I think just to see like a normal person and like even in that movie getting to get a look inside speech therapy, and at the end he still is stuttering a little bit. He has that cool line like, I had to throw in a couple so you would know it was me. Like the movie had just like a really cool opening and ending scene and then kind of like a lot of filler in the middle. But I feel like the like opening where like he's just at the mic staring out at this crowd of people staring at him and then can't get his first word out is such like a central experience for all of us who stutter. And to see that in a movie, I think really like froze a lot of us in our tracks.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And that's the thing too, is that, yeah, representation has to start somewhere. And oftentimes it doesn't start in the best of places, but that doesn't make it any less important for the time. So, yeah, so let's hop into talking specifically about your documentary then. So let me, which question I want to do first? Okay, so yeah, can you just kind of introduce, the documentary, The Way We Talk, and how that kind of came about?
Sure. The Way We Talk kind of, well, it's like a personal documentary. It's like a first person feature film. There's like a long tradition of like really beautiful first person cinema that the movie is kind of like an extension of, to explore stuttering and the parts of ourselves that make us feel ashamed and that we would rather not look at. Like stuttering to me is a really cool metaphor, just because like all of us, I think, all of us have something, at least, if not multiple things that like we would rather hide from the outside world, that do make us feel shame and that we wish were like not a part of ourselves. And then by like actually like looking at that and beginning some kind of process of accepting that, you become connected with the rest of humanity, to see us all as like, people who are working on these things. And so using stuttering as kind of a launch pad to explore that, it was more like about my family, because stuttering, I think it's like in roughly half of people who stutter, there's like a very pronounced family history. Like my mom stutters, my brother stutters, my grandpa also did. That's as far back as we know. And yeah, there's like things that are passed down in families, like by silence, basically. Things that like are not talked about. And even though we all had this issue, like it was just never talked about openly outside of like speech therapy, where we were working on it to go away, But stuttering is kind of a unique speech issue too, just because it often doesn't go away in speech therapy. That's pretty common. And I think there's like a big movement in the speech therapy world right now, just from working on this film and talking to a lot of speech therapists, of like changing that attitude. It's like not like someone is having a hard time saying R sounds, and so you just practice your R sound. With stuttering, like I would go to speech therapy, and my speech therapist would give me like a newspaper to practice reading out loud. And with her, I could read it completely fluently. And then I would go back to class and, raise my hand, and the teacher would call on me, and I couldn't say the first word that I wanted to. And so it's like, it's quite a complicated issue, stuttering. The like cause is still unknown. It's like linked to like certain parts of the brain that are connected to like Parkinson's, or like, it's like different, and it's like, different areas of like the like brain light up when people who stutter are studied. Like we can like sing or whisper or talk in accents and stuff without stuttering, but in our normal voice, like stuttering is there. But like a lot of it is just random too. Like, so anyway, it's just extremely complicated. And I felt like there was just like a lot there to explore in a movie. And then of course, like, and I had this idea to make this movie for a long time. And it wasn't until finally going to a support group for people who stutter in Portland, and just like going around this table and like hearing everybody share their story, when I was like, oh my gosh, we're doing this. Just because then I could go up to every person at the table and be like, can I come and interview you at your house? Just because I was just like so stunned that there were all these people here who also stuttered. I had never really met anyone who stuttered prior to that besides my brother. And just hearing all these like diverse experiences, it was just an amazing experience. And so the film kind of grew out of that.
Yeah, something that you kind of discussed is the situational nature of it, right? So you said that like, when speech therapy, it would be totally fine. And then you get in front of a class and it would come back in full force. So like, it kind of reminds me of masking, which is a common issue for neurodivergent people. Have you noticed if either your own or others' stuttering patterns change when you're only speaking with other people who stutter? Like in that support group, did your speaking patterns change, if that makes sense?
I think what I've observed is that there's like a spontaneity of speech. There's like a joy in speech rather than like any particular pattern that changes. I feel like, there are these conferences for people who stutter that happen like every year. And there's just so much joy going to like a restaurant with 15 people who stutter, sitting down at a table, and the like waiter comes over and is taking everybody's order and is just like, what is happening? Like what is happening here? Rather than being the only person who stutters, who can't say their order. It's often like a moment of like shame when you're with a group of people. But when everyone stutters and is like trying to say what they want, and just like everyone starts laughing, it's like you're just with your people, And I think that's what this movement in speech therapy is kind of moving towards, kind of getting out of this model of like fluency being a goal, but being able to like speak spontaneously without fear of social penalty being a goal.
Yeah, I really like that, because that was something too, that talking about how it was difficult for, like, not difficult. You were what you were able to eat at restaurants was driven by what you could order without stuttering. And I thought that was such an interesting point that I hadn't thought of before, is like, and you also kind of mentioned this earlier too, in the tactics that you come up with to work around having to say certain sounds or words that you know that you'll stutter on, in terms of like the way that we create both like accessibility for ourselves as disabled people, like creative ways around it, but then also trying to fit into this mold to avoid the difficulty of like presenting as disabled or coming, that kind of thing, or, yeah, I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
So kind of on that note, you spoke not in the podcast, you spoke in your film about how your grandma went so far as to pay for a speech therapist as she wanted to hear you speak fluently before she died. And I thought that was really poignant. I was wondering if you'd be comfortable sharing if that felt like a kind of pressure, if that felt, if you felt obligated in some way, only because it reminds me of the very well-intentioned ableism that surrounds us every day. You see people who put their body through unnecessary stress and strain to do something like walk down the aisle on their wedding day, since walking is seen as better and prettier than using a mobility device, or those videos of people getting like children getting cochlear implants and hearing sound for the first time. That again, it's that well-intentioned ableism of like, see, look at them, that kind of thing, but that can have a lot of pain behind the scenes.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, like, I guess I wanted to include that scene just to show that, like, just how that it's like just like a complicated issue, like you're saying, it's like my grandma saying that she wanted to hear me speak fluently before she died. It's like, oh my gosh, like, like part of me did want to give her that. But I also, I was in my 20s at that time. She died when I was about 25. And this was a couple years before that. And I think by that time, I was already, like, I'd already realized that speech therapy, for whatever reason, just didn't work for me. It would, like, I would get some kind of temporary relief by learning these different tools that would allow me to stutter less. And then at some point I would get tired of using these tools because I just wanted to talk. And then the stuttering would come back. And so I guess I thought it would just be interesting to include that, just because, like you were saying, we have this pressure from the outside world, and not just the outside world, but even like often from our own family, to conform to the norms that they like wish we were, or closer to some like normal human experience that doesn't really exist. And I wish my grandma had said, I love the way you talk, call me and let's talk, which she would say, I should add. Not that she loves how I talk, but she always wanted me to call her, to talk to her. But I feel like, if we had that message in our lives earlier, just like I, if I was like a kid and someone was just being like, oh, like, I like love the way you talk just as it is, or like, telling someone some story and my mom would be like, okay, stop, breathe. And that would just drive me nuts, rather than just like, oh, that's so amazing, like what happened next? Like, that's so funny that happened. And so, yeah, it's just kind of a complicated issue, but yeah, with my daughter and just how I live now and getting to meet like a lot of kids who stutter since making the film too, it's like, I just hope that attitude is in the world more. And I feel like by being more open about my stuttering and like even, going to my wife's school where she teaches and she's had kids who stutter in her class and being able to like, just talk to the class stuttering openly. I don't know what kind of impact that has on them, but I think it like would have had an impact on me when I was their age. So yeah, we just kind of keep trying.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it goes back to what we're talking about representation, right? That doesn't just have to be on the screen. It can absolutely be in the real world and in building community with other people, with shared experience. So then on that note, what was running the stuttering support group in Portland like?
Um, it was great. I selfishly took on that role, I should admit, because I was making the movie and I wanted to film this group. And so I felt like by becoming, and I should also say that the position opened up because the guy who had been running it became a father and he no longer had time. And I was like, yeah, I'll just do it. Because no one else volunteered. That was even kind of before the movie really got started. And then I ran that group until I became a father myself and also felt like I was like, okay, I need some time here to be awake all night in my own home. But running the group was really cool. I mean, it's like, of course it's awesome, to like see someone who stutters just show up at the group for the first time. After I had that experience, you would just see, some woman show up, she's just not saying anything because all of us kind of know each other. There would be maybe like, 10 or 12 people there. There'd be some woman there who does not know anyone. We don't know her. She would just be there kind of like staring silently at everyone. Like we would start going around the table, just saying our names and stuff, and she would just start crying. There was just like a lot of those kind of experiences. And there were a lot of things that came up, like even like there were teachers in Portland, speech pathology teachers who would send their students to the group to come observe in the group. So it was kind of interesting to have to like navigate that too, and whether that was okay, because of course you like want these students to actually hear these stories because they're going to be the ones who work with people who stutter. But having to decide whether this is going to be just like a sacred space for people who stutter to be with each other or our families, or if it's going to have like, like students there watching because it's like a different vibe. So it, like a lot of questions came up that we would have to kind of move through to just kind of keep it growing and making sure it was like meaningful for everyone who was there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's definitely balancing the support and then also the advocacy group, even if that's not something, I mean, it's not intended as an advocacy group, but again, by being a group of people who are marginalized in one way or another, it kind of comes with the territory. And so that's definitely a difficult thing to balance, I'd imagine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So something that I'm trying to figure out what the best order is here. I have so many thoughts at once. So in the documentary, you went to Japan. And this is very much my linguistic brain intrigued by this because I was wondering if you know if stuttering manifests differently in different languages. So like the American speech therapist that you interviewed spoke about how vowels were a common problem for stutterers. Mm-hmm. But in a language like Japanese that is very, very different from English, mm-hmm. like how does that problem carry over? Did you get a chance to have that kind of conversation with anyone?
Well, it's a good question. Like I think I think it's in terms of that, I think it's more of an individual thing, like whether your main problem is vowels or consonants, or it's like certain words that give one person who stutters trouble will be very easy for another person. But I think like what I did see was just more the like attitudes. Like Japan is a country, from what I understand, where disability is very hidden. Like they do I mean, yeah, it's interesting. They like, I think they're more advanced than us in many ways, in the ways that like people with, for example, like autism, they have like their own society almost, where they have like jobs to do every day, like places to go and be with each other. But at the same time, it's like I think that those places are kind of like out of sight of the public eye usually. Um, and so I think what that leads to also is the support group that I went to there was much more radical than any group I had been to in the States, where no one in this group was in speech therapy. It was like very much like, we are okay if you have a if like anyone has a problem with stuttering, it's your problem, it's not mine, like there was one point where like they were asking me how many people in my group in Portland were in speech therapy. I was like, almost everyone, and they're like, well, why? And I was like, oh, well, it's like hard to be a person who stutters, as you go to a coffee shop, you try and order your drink and you can't say it, and you get stared at, and it's just this kind of negative cycle. And this person in the group was like, it sounds like you should be in therapy for your inferiority complex. And everyone in the group started laughing. Just kind of like, damn, dude, that is absolutely true. And it kind of forced me to confront a lot of things that I'd kind of been like tiptoeing around, but just to see this whole group of people who were like so on the same page with speech therapy and speech pathology, even like that phrase, like, and the connotations it has, it definitely shook me up a little bit. And it kind of forced me to like be a little bit more radically accepting of myself, and like what I think speech therapy should be, or whatever. So yeah, I feel like that visit had a huge impression on me, and I would love to go to more countries and see how stuttering is dealt with there. I've had the opportunity to like communicate with different, some people through like email and stuff, who are starting groups in different countries, who have wanted to show the movie there as, in some different languages and such. It seems like in most countries, stuttering is still seen very much as like a problem that needs to be erased as soon as possible. And there are support groups starting all over the world too, of people who stutter, pushing back on that and saying, this is who we are, this is how we talk, and we're going to be open about it. So it's kind of an interesting time right now.
Yeah. And, talking about how like in Japan, like this group was very much like, why would you go to speech therapy? It kind of it brings me back to when earlier you were talking about how you would sometimes have these tools that then you would just get tired of using. And I think that's an interesting way of looking at it too, is like these tools that are supposedly to help you are not, like, they're more exhausting for you to use. I think that's something that like it's like the thing of like, we're so busy trying to fix the problem that it's like not actually looking at if it's a problem or not. Right.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, I also just find it fascinating. Like, I love that whole, like, I love that it's a more like underground radical movement of very like internal community, because I think too, and this again isn't, I would say it's probably more of a Western issue, but it's just the concept of assimilation rather than liberation from these expectations, right? And so again, it's totally understandable in a lot of ways, because it's like, you don't really want to have to be a radical, activist when you're just trying to get a coffee. So it definitely has its downsides, but I think that's also like a really interesting differing way of looking at it.
Yeah. And also, I mean, now as a father, it's like, my daughter doesn't stutter now. Like, she had like a couple of years, she's 5 now. When she was 3, she really started stuttering a lot. And it went away like it does in most kids who like exhibit stuttering. But like, especially during that time, I think it was much more like, for me, going and ordering a coffee and stuttering openly, just so people can hear it, like, was important. Like, that was something that was on my mind a lot, just to be like, I feel like those of us who stutter, who, when I was a kid and someone would comment on my stuttering, that would ruin my month, but now it's like, I don't really care that much anymore. Like, I'm like better at like seeing people who are like kind and patient, who almost like wink when you're stuttering, and these people know what's happening, because they probably have like a loved one who stutters, or a child who stutters. And just being more mindful of those kind of interactions too, rather than the like one person who's like, "What? Did you forget your name?" But I think too, it's like, it ties back to what we were talking about at the start of this conversation too, about like disability being something that does tie into every part of you. And like, I think that's one thing I learned in Japan too, at this group, or helped me see that, was just like, why do we want stuttering to go away, when in so many things it led me to like every part of myself that I am proud of now? It's like making movies. Like, I don't know if I would have been even interested in the arts at all if I didn't stutter. I don't know if I would be able to have like empathy for other people the way I do if I didn't stutter. Like, my wife talks about, like, we met in a college class, and she talks about seeing me raise my hand in that class for the first time and stuttering, trying to say like what I wanted to say, and what an impact that had on her, and it's like, she's like my best friend and the person who I love, and so it's like, how much did stuttering kind of making her take a second look at me or something, you're like, who is this person? It's like, I think in so many ways, it kind of brought me to where I am in life right now. And to be like, I don't like want this part of myself to be there. It's like, almost like, what else is there?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So I can't remember if you mentioned this in the documentary specifically. So what brought you to Japan rather than like a different country, since you just mentioned like the other places that were interested now in it?
Well, it's kind of a random story, but my wife, her grandparents had an exchange student that lived with them when he was in college, Japanese exchange student. And he became, he lived with them for 4 years and became kind of like a brother to her dad. And he came here on his honeymoon with his wife from Japan. And so when my wife and I got married, he reached out to us and said, I want you to come to Japan for your honeymoon and stay with my family. So yeah, nothing to do with stuttering. His daughter is actually here in Oregon right now at college. So it's, the family bond is going still. But yeah, there was like, even going to the group there for the first time was so interesting. And like, I had a really hard time. Like I just have a hard time in other countries that don't speak English, or even that speak English, because I feel like learning a new language and like trying to speak to someone in a new language very awkwardly, and then you add stuttering in the mix, and it's very hard to be understood. It's very confusing for people, and so I was getting pretty frustrated with that over there. Like I don't have the chance to travel internationally very often in my life, so it was like a kind of like a tough experience to be there and not really being able to communicate with anybody. And so even when I, before I could film at the group, I had this like, had to have this private meeting with like the sensei's apprentice or something who met with me, and he's like, all right, have to see what's up with this guy. And so even just meeting this guy who stuttered also, like we just hit it off right away, because it was just so freeing to meet someone who stuttered on this trip. And we spoke through a translator, but even just being, talking in two different languages and both of us stuttering, there was a bond right away, that kind of transcended that, which was really cool.
That's awesome. I like that it was more random than intentional, honestly. It just, that's where always like the best stories come from, I found, especially with the documentary, when you're trying to find the story as you go. So that's really cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's see. What was my last question? So stuttering, and we've kind of mentioned this already, but stuttering exists in an odd nexus of disability where it's not something inherently painful. But even with social acceptance, it seems frustrating for the stutterer. But, we've already kind of, as you've spoken more, I would already change that question, because it seems again that it is the lack of social acceptance that is the frustrating part. So what, based on your lived experience, do you feel is the best way forward in advocating alongside and supporting stutterers?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, it's something that I've been talking a lot about with people this past year, just like how to support people with different experiences than me and be an advocate for them. Which can be challenging, because I always want to like insert myself into it and be like, oh, that's like stuttering. But I mean, honestly, like, I think, yeah, I mean, it's like I think about like kids who stutter and what would be meaningful for them. But really, I mean, I feel like it's just listening to their experience, and like not pushing like an ableist view of what speech should be. But like when someone is stuttering, kind of like you're doing right now, it's like you just like keep eye contact, you're listening, I feel like it's so easy to like avert your eyes, or just like through some like unconscious like movement, you're like showing that what the speaker is doing is not right, And just to touch on what you were saying too, it's like really do think it's like a mix of like just the social pushback you get from stuttering, but also like I feel like most of it is internal, just from these little gestures that people who stutter, or probably people with any disability, like we just accumulate this body of like not knowledge, kind of like the opposite of knowledge, but like, and so we like move through the world always like feeling like we're not right, like feeling like there's some like nebulous sense of failure or shame that we take with us everywhere from like growing up in our society where these things are like not made to be okay. I feel like if stuttering was seen to just be normal, and like, oh, this person stutters, so it's going to take them like an extra few seconds to say this, like it would really not be an issue, because as you were saying, it's like not painful, it's exhausting, and like a lot of people get like headaches from not being able to like breathe while talking and that kind of stuff. But pain wise, I would say it's like extremely low. It's like just something that like comes with like a lot of shame, and I think that's something that like you can work on, like as a society and like as a friend or a family member, just letting someone know that they're okay.
Yeah, and I think that's I think that's a great point, because one of the other questions that I had written down that I was like trying to figure out how I wanted to incorporate it was discussions about trying other modes of communication if you stutter, right? So it's like, not for the sake of saying you shouldn't talk with a stutter, but for the sake of like, that's the difficult thing, right? Is like, when I was writing the question, it was the intention of like, are there ways of communicating that we could start structuring into daily life more that would be more accessible and more helpful? But then it kind of also comes with the implication of like, because you shouldn't be speaking with a stutter, which is like important to point out, because I was thinking of just, and I mean, this implies this ties into other disabilities as well, right? Like you have ASL, so like signing. I know sometimes people who, I'm trying to remember the term, I want to say selectively mute. That could be wrong, but will write things down. We'll have like we'll text people, like even if they're sitting right next to each other, they'll just communicate through text. And so it's an interesting thing to navigate, because it's like, how can we create more accessibility without, again, it being the implication of like, we want you to use this other mode of communication because the way of communicating that you're currently doing works for you, but it doesn't work for us, that kind of thing. And that's super tricky, because it is very individual.
Right. Like, did you see that there was this short film that actually, like, I think it like won the Oscar for short films. So it was kind of like big news in the stuttering world. Like a few years ago, maybe like 2016 or something, there was this movie called Stutterer. It's like a short film, obviously made by someone who does not stutter, where it's like following this like guy, this like handsome, like brooding actor guy who stutters, and like he's on a dating site. He's going to like meet somebody, and he's so nervous that he's going to go out on this date. And, the movie is kind of building up to this moment when he's on the date and stutters. And then it turns out that this whole time, his date is deaf, and so can't hear him anyway. And it's like this like kind of happy, like, oh, like, what was I so worried about? And it's like, it was just like, it kind of like haunted me more and more afterwards, of just like, why do I hate this movie so much? And then it was just like, dude, what if this guy opened his mouth and stuttered, and his date was like, oh, no problem. You stutter. Tell me about stuttering. It's just like, And then he heard like her experience of being a woman or whatever, rather than two people who are like communicating on these different planes, which is cool in a sense. It's like I would love to learn sign language. I think it's such like a beautiful language with such like an incredible history of like activism. But yeah, I mean, I like do feel like people who stutter love to talk as much as anybody else, and it's like it feels good to be able to do that spontaneously and with like joy and excitement.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's the way that Hollywood views disabled people is kind of wild. It's very strange. And even with more pushes for behind the scenes representation, in terms of like, disabled writers, disabled directors, and better casting choices, because, it's like the very, very few disabled characters that exist will always be played by abled actors.
Mm-hmm.
But again, the culture around it is so strange. And so it's like, I don't know. I mean, it's ableism. It's not, it's not like it doesn't have a name and doesn't have a reason.
Mm-hmm.
It's built in society because of capitalism. That's a whole other conversation. But
Mm-hmm.
it's sometimes just the absurdity of how Hollywood is like, here you go, this is disability, and every disabled person is like, what the fuck are you on? Like,
yeah.
So yeah, so that was all of the questions I had. Was there anything that you wanted to talk about that you feel like we didn't get a chance to cover?
Not that I can think of. I just appreciate you taking this time to highlight stuttering and get the word out a little bit about it.
Yeah, well, and I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me on the podcast. I think this is going to be a really cool episode, and I'm excited to try something different with the way I edit, or in this case, will not edit certain things, like,
Dirty sound.
Sorry.
Dirty sound.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, that's going to be, I think, really important for the way that I look at this work, and also, hopefully getting the word out there more about just encouraging people to check out your documentary is a great resource.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, Leo.
Yeah, thank you. It was great chatting. I really enjoyed this conversation. Before we wrap up, EOSIL has asked to include this message about COVID-19 vaccinations from Judy Heumann, who is an American disability rights activist. Judy is known primarily for her work as an international advocate for people with disabilities, which she has been leading since the 1970s, as well as recently starring in the documentary film Crip Camp.
Hello, my name is Judy Heumann. I'm here today to encourage you to please take your COVID vaccine. And if you have friends and family that haven't, please encourage them also. COVID is to be taken seriously. In addition to taking the vaccine, please use other protective methods. Wear a mask, use gloves, and sanitize frequently. If you need additional information and you live in Eastern Oregon, you can contact EOCIL. Thank you, and protect yourselves and the community.
If you're interested in learning more about cultural assumptions regarding disability and the history of how the term developed, this episode's recommended book is Enforcing Normalcy by Leonard J. Davis. The link to purchase this book can be found in the episode description, or check it out and support your local library. You can also find Mike's documentary, The Way We Talk, at Vimeo On Demand, which will be linked below. Thanks again to Mike Turner for speaking with me. This has been Voices in Action, a podcast brought to you by EOSIL. Stay informed, stay safe, and remember, there are many different ways to communicate.